your child asks you for help, you don't think twice, you just do it. That's what being a parent is all about, right? Showing up, being the safety net, the protector. I'd done that all my life, ever since my son was born. Scraped knees, broken hearts, lost jobs. I was there through it all. But nothing prepared me for the day he walked into my house, eyes heavy, shoulders slumped like he was carrying the weight of the world. He said, "Dad, I need a favor." And something in his voice chilled me to my core. I didn't know what he was about to ask, but I knew instantly it was going to be big, too big. The kind of favor that shifts something between a father and son. That day, sitting across from the boy I raised, the man he was trying to become, I found myself staring down a question I never thought I'd have to ask. What if helping him would only hurt him in the long run? What if, by saving him from his mistakes, I was stealing the lesson he needed to grow? That moment forced me into a decision that I knew would shake him, maybe even break him. But I made it anyway. Because sometimes love doesn't look like a warm embrace or a helping hand. Sometimes love looks like saying no, like stepping back so someone you care about can step up. I never thought I'd be the one to teach him the hardest lesson of his life. But life doesn't always give you easy choices, only meaningful ones. And what I did next? It changed everything. My name is Joseph. I'm a retired construction worker. Nothing fancy. Just a man with rough hands, a stiff back, and a lifetime of early mornings and honest labor. I spent over 4 decades building homes for other people, pouring foundations with my own 2 hands, hammering frames in the dead of winter, sweating under the summer sun, and putting food on the table the only way I knew how, through grit, sacrifice, and consistency. I never got rich and I never cared to. What mattered to me wasn't how much I had in my pocket, but how much I could give my family. A roof over their heads, clothes on their backs, and the kind of love you don't need to say out loud because it's shown through every scraped knuckle and every missed night of sleep. I come from a generation where showing up meant everything, and responsibility wasn't optional. You didn't complain. You carried your weight. That's how I tried to raise my son, Thomas. I taught him that money didn't grow on trees, that respect was earned, not given, and that if you wanted something in this life, you had to work for it. I didn't want to raise a boy who thought the world owed him anything. I wanted to raise a man who could stand on his own 2 feet. When he was little, I'd take him out to the job sites on weekends, just to show him what real work looked like. He'd sit in the truck, eating his peanut butter sandwich, watching the men pour concrete and swing hammers. He told me once, "I want to be strong like you, Dad." And I believed he could be. I believed he would be. That was before life got complicated. Before things shifted. You see, everything changed when my wife, his mother, passed away. Cancer took her fast. One year she was baking pies in the kitchen, humming along to old country songs, and the next, she was gone. Just like that. The silence that followed her death settled into the walls of our home like dust that refused to be swept away. I tried to be strong for Thomas even when I was falling apart inside. He was only 16, still a kid, still trying to figure himself out, and now, suddenly motherless. I became both parents overnight, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never fill her shoes. She had a softness to her I didn't. She knew how to reach him in ways I didn't always understand. And so I did what I knew. I showed up. I worked longer hours to make sure he could still have what he needed. I helped with his homework at night, even though I barely understood algebra. I packed his lunches, drove him to school, tried to keep the lights on, literally and figuratively. I gave him everything I could, time, attention, money when it was needed. But looking back now, I wonder, did I go too easy on him after we lost her? Did I try to protect him from the world so much that I accidentally shielded him from the lessons he needed to learn? I never intended to spoil him. That was never the goal. But grief can cloud your judgment, and sometimes love makes you blind. I just didn't want him to feel like he had no one. I didn't want him to think he was alone in the world. I wanted to be his anchor, Something steady in a time when everything else felt like it was drifting away. Over the years, I watched him grow. He was smart, charming, had that same laugh his mother did, the kind that lit up a room. But I also started noticing signs I couldn't ignore. He was impatient with effort. If something didn't come easy, he moved on. He changed college majors 3 times before dropping out. Took up jobs here and there, bartending, landscaping, a short stint at a car dealership, but never stuck with anything for long. He had dreams, sure, but no real direction, and every time he stumbled, I'd be there to pick him up. A few hundred here, a few thousand there. Just until I get back on my feet, he'd say. And I'd believe him, because I wanted to believe him. Part of me was proud that he felt comfortable enough to come to me when he was in trouble. But another part of me, one I tried to silence, started to worry. What if he was depending on me too much? What if he never learned to depend on himself? I kept telling myself he'd grow out of it, that he just needed more time, that eventually life would teach him the lessons I couldn't. But deep down, I think I knew that if I kept stepping in to save him, he'd never have a reason to change. Still, he was my boy, the only family I had left. And even though we argued, from time to time, about his choices, his spending, his attitude, I never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping he'd turn things around. Every time he said he was trying, I held on to that. Because when you're a parent, hope becomes a kind of currency. It's what keeps you going when the progress is slow and the mistakes keep piling up. You keep hoping, you keep believing, you keep showing up. That's the kind of father I tried to be. Not perfect, not always patient, but present, grounded, reliable. I didn't grow up with much, but I knew the value of family. I knew what it meant to stand in the gap when things got hard, and I thought, maybe if I just kept holding that line, Thomas would eventually catch up to it, that he'd see the path I tried to pave for him and choose to walk it himself. I just didn't expect that one day he'd come to me with a request so heavy. It would shake everything I believed in. A favor that would make me question whether being a good father meant saying yes or finally saying no, or finally. It started like any ordinary evening. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops and feeling the quiet ache in my bones that always came with the end of the day. The house was still, almost too still, just the way it had been for years since my wife passed. The kind of quiet that isn't peaceful but hollow. I was thinking about nothing in particular, maybe just replaying old memories like I usually did when the world slowed down when I heard the sound of the front gate creak open. A few seconds later, Thomas stepped onto the porch. He wasn't smiling. His head was down, hands shoved into the pockets of a worn-out hoodie, the same one I'd seen him wear when he was in high school and trying to act like life didn't scare him. But this time he wasn't trying to look tough. He looked tired, heavy. I knew something was wrong the moment I saw his face. Fathers just know. I waited for him to speak, but he didn't. He sat down beside me, staring off into the darkening sky, and for a long time neither of us said a word. Then finally he broke the silence. "Dad," he said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard. I need a favor." My heart sank, because I already knew. It wasn't going to be a small one, it never was. I didn't say anything right away, just waited. And then he started to explain. He told me he'd gotten into some financial trouble. Nothing illegal, he was quick to say. Just stupid decisions. Credit cards, impulse purchases, trying to impress people who didn't care about him. A few months of pretending he had it together when everything was falling apart behind the scenes. It started with a small loan, then another. Then came the interest, the late fees, the desperation. By the time he came to me, he was thousands in debt, his credit was shot, and he was out of options. He'd burned through his savings. He'd borrowed from friends. He was out of time. "I just need a little help to get back on track," he said. And I could see the shame in his eyes, like he was trying not to cry. "I swear, I'll pay you back. I'll make it right." I wanted to believe him. God knows I did. But this wasn't the first time Thomas had needed rescuing. It was just the biggest. Over the years, I'd helped him more times than I could count. co-signed a car he couldn't afford, paid a few months' rent when he was between jobs, even slipped him cash under the table when he was too proud to ask but clearly struggling. Every time he promised it was the last. Every time I told myself I was doing the right thing, that I was helping. That's what fathers do, isn't it? But this time felt different. Not because the number was bigger, but because something in me hesitated. I'd worked my whole life for the money I had, nothing extravagant, just enough to live modestly, to keep the lights on and maybe enjoy a few good years of retirement without worry. That money wasn't just numbers in a bank account. It was time I spent away from home, weekends I gave up, birthdays I missed, injuries I pushed through. Every dollar had a cost. And now my son, my only son, was asking me to give away a chunk of it for mistakes he'd made. Again. The silence between us grew heavier. I could feel him watching me, waiting for an answer. But inside I was struggling, not just with the money, but with everything it represented. I kept thinking about how I'd raised him, about the values I thought I'd instilled, responsibility, accountability, hard work. I thought I'd done everything right. But now I couldn't help but wonder, had I failed him? Had I made it too easy to fall back on me instead of standing up on his own? Or maybe this was just life doing what life does, teaching hard lessons in the messiest ways. Either way, I knew this decision wasn't just about money. It was about drawing a line, about asking myself what kind of help truly helps, and what kind simply delays the growth someone needs. I looked over at him and saw a man still trying to figure out how to be one. And that realization hurt, because I loved him, fiercely, unconditionally. But love isn't blind, and it isn't always soft. Sometimes love is sharp and heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel the conflict inside me, my instincts screaming to protect him, to shield him, to say, "Of course, son, I've got you." But something deeper, something wiser, told me this was a moment I couldn't fix with a check. If I gave him the money with no strings, would it really solve anything? Or would it just push the lesson further down the road until it came back again? Bigger, uglier, more painful. Still, saying no outright felt cruel. So I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I told him I needed some time to think. He nodded, but I could tell he was disappointed, maybe even angry. He stood up, said he'd check in later, and walked off into the night. And I just sat there feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind raced with questions. Was I being too harsh? Too cautious? Was I doing the right thing or just protecting myself from more hurt? The truth is, I didn't have the answer. Not then. But I knew one thing for sure. If I gave him this money, something had to change. I couldn't keep rescuing him and calling it love. This time, if I said yes, it would come with conditions. Real ones. Ones that might just change the course of his life, and mine. That night, after Thomas walked away, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the same four walls I'd seen for the past 30 years. The hum of the refrigerator, the quiet tick of the old wall clock, the fading smell of coffee, everything. Around me was still, but inside my chest it felt like a storm had started. I kept running the conversation over and over in my mind, picking apart every word he'd said and every word I hadn't. My son had come to me, not just for money, but for help, the kind of help that had strings I couldn't ignore anymore. I thought about the look in his eyes when he told me he'd run out of options. That kind of look haunts a parent. It makes you feel helpless, guilty, and protective all at once. But it also made me angry. Angry at him for letting it get this far. Angry at myself for maybe letting it happen on my watch. I tried to tell myself that he was still learning, still figuring life out like all young men do. But the truth was harder to swallow. He was 28 years old. Not a boy, not a college kid, a grown man. A man who kept making the same mistakes and expecting a soft place to land. I sat at the kitchen table until the sun started bleeding through the blinds, lighting up the room with a kind of quiet judgment. That's when the weight of it all really hit me. This wasn't just about whether or not I should lend my son money. This was about legacy, about fatherhood, about the kind of man I was trying to shape long after the job should have been finished. I thought back to the years after my wife passed, when it was just me and Thomas trying to navigate a broken world. I did everything I could to keep things together. I made his favorite dinners even when I had no appetite. I taught him to drive in an empty church parking lot. I worked overtime to cover his college tuition, just so he wouldn't start life burdened by debt. I gave him chances, so many chances, to get it right. But somehow here we were again, and this time, it felt different. It felt heavier. Part of me wanted to believe that this would be the last time, that maybe he'd finally learned his lesson, that this would be the turning point he needed. But the other part, the part that had seen this pattern before, knew better. I wasn't just tired of lending money. I was tired of feeling like I had to choose between being a loving father and an enabler. Every time I bailed him out, I watched him reset his life like it was a game. He'd get a fresh start, only to fall back into the same habits, overspending, skipping out on obligations, chasing the appearance of success without building the foundation to hold it up. And every time he failed, it chipped away at my hope just a little more. Not my love, never my love, but that sense of trust, that belief that he was growing into the man I always knew he could be. And yet, despite everything, I couldn't shake the image of him as a little boy, sitting at the kitchen table with a crayon in one hand and a bowl of cereal in front of him. His mother would be humming while washing dishes, and I'd be packing up my tools for the day. He'd look up and say, "Be careful, Daddy," like I was walking into battle. In his eyes, I was invincible. And now, he was asking me to be that man again, to fix things, to shield him from the pain of his choices. But the truth is, I wasn't invincible anymore. My back hurt when I stood too long. My hands shook some mornings. My savings, while hard-earned, weren't limitless. And more than that, I knew that helping him now the way I always had wouldn't fix him. It might actually break him. Because this wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a character crisis. And the stakes weren't just dollars and cents, they were about who he was becoming. And who I was if I let it keep happening. The guilt was crushing. Every parent wants to give their child the best. But what happens when giving becomes taking? When your help becomes their crutch? I started questioning everything I'd done. Had I been too soft? Too available? Did I unintentionally teach him that consequences were optional? That no matter how badly he messed up, I'd always be there to sweep the pieces off the floor? And what did that mean for him? For his future wife? His future kids? If he ever had any? Was I shaping a man who could lead a family? Or one who would always need rescuing? These weren't just abstract fears. They were real, living questions that clawed at me every time I looked at the man he'd become and the boy I still saw behind his tired eyes. I thought about all the things I'd wanted for him, not money or success, but peace, stability, the kind of life where he could look in the mirror and be proud of who he saw. And I knew deep down that pride didn't come from handouts. It came from struggle, from discipline, from being forced to face your mistakes and claw your way back. That's how I'd done it. That's how his mother had done it. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to learn it too. The more I sat with it, the clearer it became. I couldn't keep pretending that love meant rescuing. I had to redefine what it meant to show up for Thomas, not by shielding him, but by giving him the space to finally confront the consequences of his actions. And yet, even knowing that, my heart wavered. I kept thinking, what if this decision pushes him away? What if he sees it as rejection, not guidance? What if I lose him completely? That's the cruel irony of parenting. You spend a lifetime trying to be the one they turn to, and suddenly you find yourself needing to be the one who steps back. I knew I was walking a fine line. Too much pressure and I could push him away forever. Too little and he'd never learn. The line between love and enabling had never felt so thin. But I also knew that protecting him from pain would only make him weaker. And life, real life, doesn't wait around for you to grow up. It knocks you flat, and if you don't know how to stand on your own, it'll keep knocking until there's nothing left. Still, I kept replaying memories like they were my lifeline. his high school graduation, the first time he fell off his bike and cried into my chest, the day he told me he wanted to be a firefighter, eyes blazing with purpose, before that dream faded into the blur of growing up and growing unsure. I loved him with a fierceness that made this decision feel like betrayal, but deep down I also knew something else. If I kept saving him from the fire, how would he ever learn to walk through it on his own? He needed the heat. He needed to feel it, to understand what his choices meant, and maybe to understand who I really was as a father. Not just someone who gives, but someone who guides, even when the path is steep. Over the next few days, I didn't hear from him. And I didn't call either. That silence between us, it used to scare me. But this time I gave it space. I needed it as much as he did. I spent the mornings walking around the house, fixing odds and ends, things I'd been putting off for months. Loose shingles, a leaky faucet, rust on the garage door hinges. And while I worked, my thoughts stayed with Thomas. I pictured him sitting in his apartment wondering what I'd decide. Maybe he was angry. Maybe he was scared. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to think about things in a new way. One afternoon, while I was out in the backyard trimming the overgrown hedges, I stopped and looked at the tools in my hands. Old, worn, but reliable. Tools I'd used for years. Tools that only worked if you put in the effort. No shortcuts, just work. And in that moment, it hit me. The answer wasn't to say no. It wasn't to say yes either. It was somewhere in the middle. It was in the earning. The lesson had to come through doing, through discomfort, through sweat and sacrifice. That's when I made my decision. I would give him the money, but it wouldn't be a gift. It would be an exchange. He would work it off, not by clocking hours at some job I couldn't track, but by working for me, here at home for an entire year. Yard work, repairs, whatever I needed. He'd have to show up, week after week, and earn every dollar back with his own hands. It wasn't punishment, it was restoration. The kind of work that might actually heal something deeper in both of us. The next day, I called him. His voice was guarded, like he didn't know whether to hope or brace for rejection. I told him I'd thought it over, that I understood he was in a tough place, that I loved him. But then I said the words that I knew would land like thunder. I'll give you the money, but only under one condition. You'll work it off, every last cent, with me, for a full year. Silence. Not even a breath on the other end. Then, a nervous laugh. Wait, you're serious? I told him I'd never been more serious. I wasn't going to write a check and pretend the problem would disappear. If he wanted my help, he had to show me he was ready to change, that he understood the value of what he was asking for, and most importantly, that he respected himself enough to rebuild from the ground up. He didn't respond right away, and honestly, I didn't expect him to. I knew it would take time for him to decide. But what mattered most was that for the first time, I wasn't just handing him a way out, I was offering him a way forward, a way to reclaim his pride, to learn the meaning of earning, not asking. I wasn't abandoning him. I was inviting him into something hard, but necessary. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There'd be days he'd resent me, days I'd question myself. But I also knew this. If he said yes, if he committed to the work, we both might come out the other side changed. Not just as father and son, but as men finally learning how to respect each other. And maybe, just maybe, ourselves. It was 4 days later when he showed up. No call, no text. Just the sound of his car pulling into the driveway early Saturday morning, right as the sun was beginning to stretch across the horizon. I was in the garage tightening some bolts on the old workbench, not expecting company, when I heard the door creak open. There he stood, Thomas, hoodie zipped halfway up, jeans smeared with dust, and a look in his eyes I hadn't seen in years. He didn't speak at first. Just looked around the garage like he was scanning for something familiar. I stood there in silence, waiting, holding a wrench in my hand like it was some sort of anchor to keep me grounded. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "What do you need done?" No arguments. No sarcasm. Just those 5 words. I studied him for a moment, wondering if this was real, if this was truly the start of something different or just another temporary moment of guilt dressed up as humility. But there was something in his voice, in the slump of his shoulders, in the way he avoided eye contact that told me this time might be different. I didn't say much, just handed him a pair of gloves and pointed to the gutters which had been clogged with leaves since last fall. He nodded and got to work without another word. I watched him from the porch. My son, the same boy who once needed me to tie his shoes and check for monsters under the bed, now up on a ladder, sleeves rolled up, hands dirty. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic, but it was something. It was the beginning. At first, I didn't know how to act around him. Part of me wanted to thank him for coming, to acknowledge the effort. But I held back. Not out of pride, but because I knew this needed to be his process, not mine. If I praised him too quickly, it might feel like charity. If I pushed too hard, it might feel like punishment. So I just worked beside him, day after day, task after task. We fixed the rotted deck boards, trimmed the hedges, painted the fence, reorganized the tool shed. Some days we barely spoke beyond a few instructions. Other days, conversation slipped in slowly. Memories, small jokes, even a few moments of laughter. The walls between us, built over years of frustration and unspoken resentment, didn't come down all at once. But brick by brick, they began to loosen. And somewhere in the middle of all the work, I started seeing him. Not as the boy who kept messing up, but as a man trying to change. Not perfectly, not quickly, but honestly. He started showing up on time. He started asking questions about the tools, about the repairs. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. He even brought his own lunch once or twice. I didn't comment on it. I just took note. A few weeks in, he sat beside me on the porch after a long day of digging out the old garden bed. His shirt was soaked with sweat, hands blistered, and face sunburned. He leaned back and let out a long breath like he was releasing years of pressure he'd been holding in. Then he said quietly, "I didn't realize how good this feels, just doing something, finishing something." I turned to him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. He wasn't asking for approval. He was confessing a truth he hadn't known he needed. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about paying back debt anymore. It was about rebuilding something far more valuable, his self-respect. Because for the first time, Thomas wasn't just doing the work. He was becoming someone new through it. Someone who understood that effort meant something. That time had value. That showing up even when it's hard, even when no one's clapping for you, is the foundation of character. I started seeing changes outside our work together too. He told me he'd picked up a second job on the weekends delivering packages. Nothing glamorous but steady. Said he wanted to get ahead, not just catch up. He stopped making excuses when things didn't go his way. Started talking less about what he wanted and more about what he was willing to do to earn it. One day he even pulled out a notepad and showed me a rough draft of a budget he was working on. "I think I've been spending like someone who thinks money grows back," he admitted with a sheepish grin. That simple sentence hit me harder than I expected, because for years I'd been trying to teach him that very lesson with lectures, warnings, even anger. But none of it stuck. And now through sweat, work, and a little silence, he was teaching it to himself. The next morning, just after dawn, I found him on the porch, sitting on the old bench with his head in his hands. He'd been there all night. I didn't say anything at first. Just opened the screen door and sat beside him. For a long time, we said nothing. The air was thick with everything unspoken: pain, regret, shame. Finally, in a voice so small I barely recognized it, he said, "I messed up." I turned to him but didn't speak. "I panicked," he continued. "The credit cards were maxed. My car broke down. I didn't want to come to you again and look like a failure. I thought I could fix it myself, get ahead, surprise you with good news. But I ended up making it worse. I betrayed you. I know I did. And I'm not asking you to. Forgive me. I just needed you to know I hate what I did. I hate who I became when I did it. And in that moment, I saw it. Not the boy I raised, not the man I feared he'd become, but someone in between. Someone broken, raw, and finally aware of the damage he'd done. Not just to me, but to himself. And maybe for the first time, he was ready to feel it, to own it. I didn't say, "It's okay," because it wasn't. I didn't say, "I forgive you," because forgiveness isn't a magic word, it's a process, but I did nod. I did sit there beside him and let my presence speak what my words couldn't. I saw his shoulders shake as he tried to hold back tears, and I let him cry. No lectures, no conditions, just grief shared between two men trying to rebuild what years of missteps had nearly destroyed. Later that morning, he came to me again, this time with a piece of paper in his hand. It was a plan, a real one. A breakdown of how he'd pay back the loan he took with interest. He offered to take on more work around the house, take fewer days off, and get a third job if needed. He told me he'd already contacted the loan agency and started the process of transferring the account back into his name. He didn't ask for another bailout. He didn't look for a shortcut. He just showed up with accountability, with responsibility, with humility. And in that moment, the last piece of me that had been holding on to fear, the fear that he would never learn, never grow, never truly own his mistakes, finally began to loosen its grip. That moment didn't erase what he'd done, but it did something deeper. It restored the one thing we'd both lost along the way. Trust, fragile, earned, not gifted, but real. He didn't just say he'd change. He proved he wanted to. And for the first time in a long time, I believed him. Not because his words were perfect, but because his actions spoke louder than anything he'd ever said. That was the climax. Not the explosion, not the argument, but the decision. His decision to face the fire, and mine to stand with him, not in front of him. It was the moment everything that came before had been building toward. A choice between bitterness and breakthrough. Between closing the door forever, or leaving it open. Just enough for change to walk through. The months that followed didn't feel like a fairy tale, and I won't pretend they were. There were still hard days, moments when I looked at Thomas and the doubt crept back in, moments when the weight of the past tried to overshadow the progress we were making. Trust isn't something you just hand back after it's been broken. It's rebuilt one moment, one choice, one action at a time. But every week he showed up. Not just physically, but emotionally. He didn't complain about the work, didn't cut corners, didn't look for praise. He just did what needed to be done. Slowly, the rhythm of our lives changed. The silence between us softened. The tension gave way to conversation. And the tasks, fixing the roof, repainting the garage, organizing the basement, became more than chores. They became bridges. Every hour we spent working side by side was a small reminder that healing doesn't always come with grand gestures. Sometimes, it comes with a paintbrush, a shovel, a shared joke in the middle of the job. And through all of it, I began to see something I hadn't fully allowed myself to believe. My son was growing up. Not because I forced him, not because I rescued him, but because I finally stepped back and allowed him to feel the full weight of responsibility, and more importantly, the pride of carrying it himself. I watched him evolve, not into a perfect man, but into an honest one. The kind who owned his mistakes, stood by his word, and didn't run when things got hard. That was more than I'd hoped for. And as for me, I changed too. I stopped defining my worth as a father by how much I could protect him, and started understanding that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone fall, just enough to learn how to rise. I learned to let go of control. I learned that being a good parent doesn't always mean saying yes or even no. Sometimes it means standing still and letting them figure it out while knowing you'll still be there when they do. By the time the year was over, the debt was paid. Not just the financial one, but the emotional one too. One afternoon, after finishing the last project on our list, a new fence that took us 2 weeks to build, Thomas looked at me with a calm I hadn't seen in him before and said, "I feel like I finally earned something real." And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride, not exactly, but something deeper. A peace. A sense that the struggle we went through hadn't been in vain. That maybe all those hard conversations, those sleepless nights, the moments when I doubted myself as a father, maybe they were leading us here. To this quiet, powerful realization that we'd both grown. Not in spite of the pain, but because of it. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about money or chores or even redemption. It was about respect. Mutual respect. He saw me now, not just as the man who'd always been there, but as someone who stood firm when it mattered. And I saw him, not as the boy who needed saving, but as a man who had earned the right to stand on his own. And I'll tell you something I never thought I'd admit out loud. In a strange way, I'm grateful for what happened. Because without that hard season, without that betrayal, that anger, that tough love, I don't think either of us would be who we are today. Sometimes the bond between a father and son isn't forged in the easy moments, it's shaped in fire, tested by disappointment, strengthened by forgiveness. And now, as I sit on this porch with a worn coffee mug in my hands and watch him pull up in a car he bought with his own money, walking with a quiet confidence that didn't exist a year ago, I feel a kind of pride that words can't quite hold. Not because he's perfect, but because he fought for his place, because he earned back his name, and because I finally learned to let him. In the end, it wasn't about the money. It wasn't even about the favor. It was about learning when to step in and when to step back, about trusting the process, and about understanding that love, real love, is often quiet, patient, and hard as hell. But when it's done right, it transforms people. It transformed him. And truthfully, it transformed me too. If you've ever been in a position where love meant making a hard decision, where helping someone you care about meant risking their anger, or even their trust, then you know just how complicated it can be. Maybe you've been the one asking for help, or maybe you've been the one forced to say no, not out of cruelty but out of hope that it might lead to something better. Either way, you're not alone. Stories like this aren't just about fathers and sons, they're about all of us, about the moments that test our limits, reshape our relationships, and push us toward growth we didn't ask for, but maybe always needed. So I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a tough decision with someone you love? Did it bring you closer, or drive a wedge between you? What would you have done in my shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and this is a space where your voice matters. If this story spoke to you, if it made you think about your own family, your own journey, or even just made you feel something, don't forget to like the video. It helps more than you know. And if you want more stories that dig deep into real struggles, hard-earned wisdom, and the beauty that sometimes comes from the hardest choices, we've got more coming. So hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell so you never miss what's next. Because life's toughest moments often lead to the most powerful transformations, and you don't have to go through them alone.